Recording started.
Okay, so we are picking up today, looking at some of the things that are taking place in the 19th century that are leading to division in the Restoration movement. And there are some things that, it's not just a matter of theology. There are a lot of things going on in the 19th century that are splitting the Restoration movement into two distinct groups, Churches of Christ and Disciples of Christ. And largely this split is taking place among economic class lines as well as regional lines. That does not mean, of course, that everyone that is joining the disciples is northern and middle class, and everyone staying with the Churches of Christ is lower class and southern. But predominantly, the fissures that are taking place are happening along these sectional and these class lines. So while we might want to look back and say that theology and a variety of religious issues are the reason for the division, that's not the entire picture. There's more than just differences in theology or differences in practice that are taking place. Those elements are important, but they are not the only ones that are developing it. That instead there's also some things that are not theological that are pushing these two groups into distinct movements. And so that's what we're looking at today. Don't forget that the next essay on Campbell's Restoration of the Ancient Order of Things is due on Friday, so this coming Friday. And the essay, the critical review essay on Alexander Campbell's The Christian System is due on March 3rd, so a week from Friday. So make sure to be keeping up with those. We finished off last Thursday talking about slavery and some of the things connected with the idea of being Southern, secession, those aspects. We're seeing that as one of the things that's creating a fissure in the movement. Now, unlike some of the other groups, Christian groups in the United States at the time, the Restoration movement does not officially divide over the issue of slavery. But to think that there is a division is to ignore the historical evidence. And a lot of people in the Restoration movement after the Civil War tried to present it as the movement had never divided over slavery. But in a sense, there wasn't the potential to divide over slavery like there was in denominations that had some sort of national board or national conferences where people could kind of split along those lines and there would be an official recognition of that split. So there's not the same sort of institutional structure in the Restoration movement like there was in the Baptists, Presbyterians, and Methodists, who all split along sectional lines because of slavery. But there were still divisions that took place in these groups. And so we looked at last Thursday at how there were both slaveholders and those that were anti-slavery in the Restoration movement. Predominantly, a lot of the early leaders, especially the major ones like the Campbells and Stone, were all anti-slavery. Those few slaves that they did have at various points in their lives, they did end up freeing. Sometimes it was a matter of having to move to a place where they could free their slaves. Sometimes it was, for example, Alexander Campbell, it was a concern that the people that, the slaves that he had inherited would be able to care for themselves. So waiting till a certain point in their life when they had, they had the skills and the abilities to care for themselves, finding jobs and other things instead of connecting with slavery. And so we also talked as well about how for a lot of those early leaders through the 30s and even into the 40s to some extent, many of them favored colonization over full emancipation in the United States. Many of them did not think in those years, those decades previous to the Civil War, that emancipation was, full emancipation in the United States was something that was possible. And so instead, it was an encouragement to free slaves and then help them get back to Africa, a common position that a lot of Christians in the North took at the time. But when those different approaches that were attempts to end slavery didn't work, a lot of those people did begin to favor full emancipation and abolition. And again, there was various positions on this issue. Campbell, for example, Alexander Campbell, took the position of gradual emancipation, which a lot of religious people and Congress people, governmental officials in the North took this position of the United States government providing slave owners with money to free their slaves to compensate them for the lost labor. And then gradually these slaves would be freed as the government continued to work through the ranks of the slaveholders. Not something that a lot of slaveholders were necessarily interested in the South, so it never really got any place in Congress because of stubborn opposition to it. But it was a position that a lot of people had, believing that immediate abolition would cause a whole host of problems, and so you gradually free them over the course of several years, several decades. The other concern as well for a lot of what we might call the more moderate people on this issue was the extremes. So those that were extremely supportive of slavery were kind of condemned, but also the extreme abolitionists were also condemned. And so Campbell, for example, attacks extreme abolitionism, felt that he could not say biblically that all slavery was sinful, believed that certain types of slavery could be godly based on the New Testament and the guidelines in the New Testament, but he ultimately felt that the way that slavery was practiced in the United States, however, was evil. So he did not support slavery in the United States as it was practiced, but he wasn't fully going to condemn slavery because he did not feel he had the biblical warrants to do so. But a lot of the northern members of the Restoration movement started to become abolitionists, wanting to push for an immediate end to slavery with no compensation for slaveholders, and all these other kind of things, feeling slavery is a moral evil. At one point in 1856, there are some students at Bethany College who preach on the sinfulness of slavery, which almost causes a riot because this is kind of, they're really pushing for it, but they do have, Bethany is located in Virginia, even though at the time today it's West Virginia, but at the time it's Virginia, so slaveholding state, a lot of Southerners, so to preach, such a sermon, of course, is going to inflame people's anger, and it led to the expulsion of some students. Others left because of this. But most of the people in the movement tended to be more moderate in their approach to slavery, but the division is taking place along sectional lines. Again, it's not an official division, but there are people in the North supporting abolition or emancipation of some sort, and in the South is supporting slavery. Most of those people in the Restoration movement tended to be very moderate in their approach. Whether that was Southerners being supportive of slavery or Northerners being supportive of emancipation, both groups were not going to the extreme, the major group. And then, of course, you have on the ends the fringes. So essentially what you have here is a slow division that's taking place. Maybe not slow, might not be the right term, a gradual division that's taking place between a group that is becoming more liberal in its mindset regarding not only theological issues but social issues, and is also becoming very much activists in trying to change society. So you have one group that's going in that direction. A lot of those tend to be in the North. Then you have another group that tends to be in the South that is more conservative in its approach, both socially and theologically, and tends to be in a position of not really being that interested in being active politically in any sort of way. And this is largely what we're talking about with this division between the Churches of Christ and the Disciples of Christ. We've seen this even before the Civil War. So this isn't something that suddenly takes place in 1906, which we noted a couple classes ago is the time that David Lipscomb said, yes, there's two groups, there's the Churches of Christ and the Disciples of Christ. This division's been going on for 60, almost 70 years by that point. And one expression of this is slavery. Now, some churches end up dividing over the issue, but most of the issue divides up on those regional lines. And as I said before, a lot of it is this kind of big moderate group in the middle, and then the fringe supporters, those that are very adamant, and those that are extremists or radicals. And in fact, because of the moderate stance of leaders like Campbell, a lot of those radicals end up kind of leaving the movement, feeling that the Restoration movement isn't addressing this issue properly. So when it comes to slavery, there was, definitely some sectional issues, and so as people ended up supporting or condemning the issue, it was largely along sectional lines. And that division, while not official, does take place to some extent. And especially when the American Christian Missionary Society comes out in favor of abolitionism and kind of makes some statements against the South, which we'll talk about in a little bit, you can see why a lot of Southerners would have wanted to kind of draw back and separate from that. Another area where we see division starting to take place. Oh, I had this on the slides, I forgot about it. So you have this division between this one group that is liberal and activistic, and then the other group that is conservative and non-active in political issues. And so that's kind of where these two groups are developing. Again, along the sectional lines as well as along class lines, with a lot of the more middle-class Northerners going the liberal route and the lower-class Southerners being more conservative. So slavery and sectionalism was one of the factors that precipitated the ultimate division between Churches of Christ and Disciples of Christ. Another place, conservative and non-active. Another place where you begin to see divisions taking place has to do with a variety of social issues, particularly as it comes to attempts to try and bring about reform in those areas. So one of those areas, we talked about last class before, about how there was a lot of interest among Protestants, particularly evangelical Protestants in the 19th century, of living out their faith in pushing for social reform. And that for a lot of people, the idea was a true expression of your religion was your interest in transforming society. And so you have that benevolent empire of all of these different parachurch organizations that were trying to bring about reform in a variety of issues. Well, when it comes to the Restoration movement, some of the same concerns are there about morality, about practice, about behavior, but there's also kind of an opposition to, among some people, how far they are willing to go in support of reform. While some people are open to the idea of joining with these other denominational and parachurch groups, others felt that any sort of reform was meant to take place through the church. And the church was God's engine for reform, so to speak. And so you have a variety of divisions here over these issues. So one of the major issues, especially in the first part of the 19th century, well, even the entirety of the 19th century into the 20th, was the issue of alcohol. Lots of concerns among Christians about the prevalence of the consumption of alcohol. And many Americans in the early 19th century drank a lot. It's estimated, so for example, one estimate is that in 1823, the yearly consumption of alcohol amounted to 7.5 gallons of liquor per person. Now that's a lot of alcohol. And obviously, not everybody is drinking that alcohol, so some people are drinking quite a bit of alcohol. So you can understand why there would be a continual concern about alcohol. Now certainly there are some who are supporting the idea of drinking in moderation. So most groups across the board, denominations, would say that drunkenness is sinful. But while some said, drinking in moderation was fine, others began to be concerned about the impact that alcohol was having on people. So that could be some of the health issues. Now, certainly they didn't understand the entirety of what we understand about what alcohol does to the body these days. But, they did see how when people got drunk, they often tripped, fell, hurt themselves, had that kind of health experiences. Others, there were other things as well, the domestic violence that was sometimes attended with alcohol, so that men predominantly getting drunk, going home, being abusive to their spouse, being abusive to their children. Again, certainly not understanding, all the facets of alcoholism or laying it out like what we see today. But, this recognition of people that drink often engage in other behaviors that are just as much of a problem. Plus, there was also the concern about the number of immigrants and lower class individuals who were the ones that were drinking a lot of the alcohol, and so they already have little wages, and they're spending so much of it on alcohol. Right? And so there's all sorts of issues that are connected with alcohol, and we can understand why there would be such a reaction by people of trying to limit the sale and consumption of alcohol, let alone trying to get rid of it. The Restoration movement had a little bit of a division over this. The editors of most of the religious journals in the Restoration movement largely encouraged total abstinence. abstinence, or what was known as temperance. Others, however, supported moderate drinking, just like what we see in the United States at large. But many of the leaders, including Campbell, were supportive of efforts to try and prohibit the manufacture and sale of alcohol. They felt that that was the direction that should be taken. And so many of the disciples throughout the 19th century gradually supported the temperance movement, the movement to try and, at the very least, limit the amount of alcohol that somebody would drink at the most, trying to prohibit the sale and consumption of it entirely. Another issue that a lot of people began to be concerned about at the time was the use of tobacco, whether smoking or through dipping or whatever else. Doesn't appear to have been as much of an issue in the 19th century for the disciples as alcohol. Now, we certainly understand again more today about the health effects. So there wasn't that much of a concern in the 19th century about what the consumption of tobacco in various forms would do to you. I mean, that's really not something that they're not thinking lung cancer, they're not thinking mouth cancer, loss of teeth, those kind of things. Instead, it was more about the uncleanness of it, especially if you were chewing, and then of course you have to spit out the juices, all that kind of stuff. And so there's that concern. There's the concern about people wasting their money on tobacco, and so it's more of an economic argument. And then there was also the concern that, well, Scripture doesn't authorize, it doesn't say it's okay for Christians to chew or smoke tobacco. So, if you're going to be consistent in your approach to scriptural silence, then you shouldn't do it because it's not permitted in Scripture. That's certainly today a weak argument. There's a lot of health arguments today to suggest why someone should stay away from tobacco in various forms. But I mean, in the 19th century, that's where the focus is. There's some discussion about what it does to people's health, but there's certainly not the knowledge that we have today. And ultimately, the worst expressions of tobacco use for a lot of people were when preachers and women did it. I mean, it was like, it's bad for men to do it, but it's even worse if it's a preacher or if it's a woman who's chewing tobacco or something like that. So there's some gender things that are attached to that as well.
I got a question. I think this is the most fitting time to ask you.
All right.
I've been thinking about some stuff. I actually got a question this morning, and I'm not going to call any names, but I have a person that's really close to me that is a Christian but has questions about the uses of marijuana. And I want to ask you what you think about it, because I know you're going to give me the best theological answer with fact and not just that feeling stuff. So,
right.
Just hit me with that, because this kind of covers it.
Right,
Some people, drinking's not bad as long as you don't get drunk. But I'm pretty sure there's that say otherwise.
Right. Yeah, so when it comes to marijuana, certainly if you're in a state where it's illegal, that's
right.
One thing, right?
Right.
But obviously there are a lot of other states where medicinal marijuana is legal. And then, of course, there are some states where recreational use of small amounts is legal as well. So, you have a couple different situations in the United States. Regarding the medicinal use of marijuana, right, which probably isn't what a lot of people are thinking about, right? It's less about that. It would seem to me that if it is legal, if it is done on the observation of a doctor, and a lot of other things that just like any other drug would be, prescription drug. That's one issue, because it does appear that there are some situations where at least the chemicals in marijuana could help certain conditions.
Right.
So, I mean, that's one issue. But recreational use of marijuana. I think probably one of the best passages on this issue would be Galatians chapter 5. Yeah. Because, I mean, obviously there's no scripture that says thou shalt or thou shalt not use marijuana, right? Right. Not an issue that they faced in the first century. So we have to kind of make a parallel. What are some other activities that are like that would give us some guidance on this? And I would say for the recreational use of marijuana, it is very similar or parallel to the use of alcohol. And so when you look at Galatians chapter 5, especially the works of the flesh, Paul has that one little comment at the very end where he says, and things like these. And so if it fits into, something like that, even though it's not specifically listed, it's probably something that should be avoided. I would think that it would be included in there. And I haven't had the experience myself, but just from what I get from popular culture and some other things, it seems to me like what happens when you take marijuana is that it does affect your moral reasoning center, so to speak. Right? Your ambitions are less, some of those other things. So I would say that probably the same passages that talk about drunkenness and other things like that would apply to someone. But, it's like, this is something that should be avoided because of what the drug does to you from your moral reasoning type of stuff. It puts you in a situation where you are not able to be sober-minded, and have a healthy outlook on reality, those kind of things. So that would be my direction.
I don't mean to take away from that.
No, that's all right.
This is the closest place to have. I hate for us to be talking about, let's say, the crucifixion. What do you think about marijuana?
Right. Yeah. So I would say that I'd go that way. I mean, certainly if it's in a state where it's illegal, then there are other passages that talk about how we're supposed to respect the laws of the land.
Right.
But in a place where recreational use would be legal, I'd say what are the principles that Scripture teaches us about what we should do to our bodies, how we should constantly be in control of our mental faculties, so that we can discern what's right and wrong. I mean, if you're not in control of your mental faculties, you're not able to make those discernments.
Right.
And so that's largely how I would approach the issue. But I mean, it was very similar to what they had to do with tobacco, right? I mean, there's no scriptures that say thou shalt not smoke.
But when you get asked, like, is it a bad thing? It's like, that's kind of big for you to ask me, because I'm not your judge. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So it's like, if you feel bad about it, or you feel that you have to make a decision whether it's right or good or bad, maybe
that should already tell you that there's something.
That's all I can say. I'm like, it's wrong in the Bible. Nope, I can't.
Right, yeah. I mean, you can talk, like I said, you can talk about the principles, but the very fact that you are even thinking to ask the question suggests that, maybe your conscience is telling you something. Because otherwise, I would think that you would be perfectly fine with it, right? I mean, if it was, when you think about, especially contrast to the works of the flesh to the works to the fruit of the Spirit, right? A lot of those things, the expression of love, joy, peace, patience, all those things, we don't have to ask ourselves, is it right to be patient in this situation? Now, often we're impatient, but I mean, we don't have to ask ourselves that. Our consciences, don't bother us because we know, hey, it's the right thing to do to be loving to somebody.
Right.
And when we have those moments of, oh, should I help this homeless person out? It's because I want to do. I'm feeling greed. I'm feeling all those other things, not truly feeling love, right? And so Yeah, by even asking the question, that should tell you something.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Another issue about reform, going back to reform, had to do with issues related to entertainment. Again, a lot of the choices we face today regarding some of these things aren't the same kind of things, aren't the same kind of issues. And in many respects, some of the things that they would have condemned, we might not have as much of a problem with. So, for example, throughout the 19th century, theater going to the theater. Now, of course, to see plays, we're not talking movies at this point, but going to the theater was often condemned as sinful for a variety of reasons. One had to do with the kind of things that were in plays, right? So immoral actions depicted in plays. Second had to do with a general kind of prejudice towards people that were in acting. They felt that they were just lived immoral lifestyles. And then, of course, there are other issues like wasting money, wasting your time. Is this the best use of your time? So there were a variety of things that 19th century Christians struggled with over the issue of entertainment. It wasn't just theater going, of course. There's issues of dancing, gambling, other types of things as well. Often, a lot of those things were considered to be, for the most part, for the early 19th century, they were among Restoration movement leaders, were considered to either be frivolous, you're wasting your money, or sinful. Right? So a lot of what we would call entertainment was usually things that were discouraged, if not outright condemned. Now, there was some variation by region as to what was sinful and what was to be avoided. Right? And some people might think, well, that's sinful, and other people might think, well, that's just something we shouldn't do, but it's not necessarily sinful. Additionally, there were differences among churches as to what kind of impact the church could have on somebody that was involved in those things. So if you had a member that you knew frequented the theater, some churches might discipline that member, either by encouraging them to repent, or if they would not be repentant, excluding them from membership. So some churches might be like that. Other churches might not have taken as harsh of a stance on that. But especially in the North, as more and more members of the Restoration movement became more affluent, became more middle class, some of those things that were originally forbidden are not as much of a problem now. And often going to the theater moves from being a sinful practice to being something that's fashionable. Right? So if you live in a city, you're middle class, that's what you do. You go to the theater. That's what it's an expression of where you are in society. And so there's some changes that take place over that. And so here too you have this kind of class division over the issue of whether or not this is sinful practice. A fourth issue that caught the attention of Restoration movement in the 19th century was the issue of the Sabbath. There were a lot of Christians in the 19th century, in general, Protestants predominantly, who encouraged, who pushed for, and who were successful in trying to pass laws that regulated what could and could not be done on Sundays. And so there was this concern among ministers, especially in the broad United States Christian culture, that there should not be any sort of secular activity on Sunday, that it should predominantly be religious activity. And so ministers preached that in the congregations, but they also encouraged governmental officials to pass that as legislation. By the Civil War, although there were certainly groups that did not support these movements towards passing Sabbath laws or Sunday laws, there was a general acceptance of them as a good activity or a good thing for the society to uphold. In the early years of the Restoration movement, however, a lot of disciples and Christians, again we're using that term specifically here to talk about the STEM movement, were against Sabbath laws or Sunday laws. There were a couple of reasons behind this. First of all, based off of Campbell's Sermon on the Law, preached in 1816, a lot of people in the movement had adopted this position that history is made up of three eras or dispensations, right? There's the patriarchal, there's the Mosaic, and then there's the Christian. And that the Christian age was guided solely by the New Testament. So the Sabbath was looked upon as, that's something from the Old Testament. We're not under the Old Testament anymore, so it's not something that needs to be followed. So that was one reason that they were against the idea, is that the Lord's Day, Sunday, is what is encouraged in the New Testament, not the Sabbath. And what a lot of denominations had done in their mind had taken Jewish ideas of the Sabbath, which referred to Saturday, and applied them to Sunday, which was the Lord's Day, which was for the Restoration movement. That's not something that you can do theologically, legitimately theologically. Another reason why a lot of early Restoration movement individuals were against Sabbath and Sabbath regulations was they felt that it was they were very, let me back up. One of the reasons they were against such legislation is that they were very supportive of the notion of separation of church and state.